Hey everyone, and welcome to today's Explainer. We are diving into an incredibly tense, defining chapter in global history today. Picture this, a high-stakes, geopolitical chess match between the British Empire and major Indian political factions, all playing out with a ticking clock of World War II in the background. Between 1939 and 1942, this global conflict forced some profound internal crises within India. It's truly fascinating to see exactly how this absolute constitutional deadlock unfolded, so let's get right into it. Here is the roadmap for this timeline of intense negotiations, ultimatums, and failed deals that basically brought the British Empire to a standstill. We'll start with the government's refusal, look at drawing lines in the sand, explore the August offer, the Individual Satyagraha, the Cripps mission, and finally, exactly how the deal collapses. All right, part one, the government's refusal. So to really wrap our heads around this deadlock, we have to jump back to the inciting incident in October 1939. Viceroy Linlithgow issued a statement that point-blank refused to define clear British war aims. Instead of offering any immediate concessions to secure Indian support for the war, he tried a totally different tactic. He attempted to leverage the Muslim League and the Indian princes against the Indian National Congress. What did he actually offer? Merely a promise of future consultations on the 1935 Act and the setup of an advisory committee. It's your classic stall tactic, right? Offering vague conversations down the line rather than handing over concrete power now. Well, the countermove to that was immediate and honestly pretty dramatic. Just days later, the Congress Working Committee completely rejected the viceregal statement, calling it out as the same old imperialist policy. But they didn't just issue a strongly worded press release. They took massive structural action. They ordered all Congress ministries to just resign from their provincial posts. Imagine the impact of that for a second. With one single move, a massive chunk of provincial governance was simply abandoned in protest. They completely withdrew their support. Which brings us to part two, drawing lines in the sand. Fast forward to March 1940, and it is wild to see the vast divergence in visions for India's future. The internal pressures of the war were forcing everyone to firmly establish their demands. On one side, you have the Congress Ramgarh Resolution. They declared they would accept absolutely nothing short of complete independence. Dominion status, completely off the table. Sovereignty, they insisted, had to rest with the people across both the provinces and the princely states in a unified India. But on the exact same timeline, the Muslim League's Lahore Resolution laid down the absolute groundwork for separate states. They demanded the grouping of geographically contiguous Muslim majority areas in the northwest and east into autonomous, sovereign, and independent states. These are two completely different, absolute, non-negotiable lines in the sand. Moving on to part three, the August offer. By the summer of 1940, the clock was loudly ticking. The war was escalating, and ignoring the situation in India clearly wasn't working for the British anymore. So Viceroy Linlithgow comes back to the table with the August offer. The specifics here are really interesting, because for the first time, the inherent right of Indians to frame their own constitution was recognized. He explicitly offered dominion status, an expanded executive council with an Indian majority, and a post-war Constituent Assembly. Crucially, though, he also promised that no future constitution would be adopted without minority consent, which essentially granted a massive veto power. But remember that fierce line in the sand the Congress drew at Ramgarh? Yeah, they weren't budging. Jawaharlal Nehru captured the reaction perfectly and energetically with this quote, "Dominion status concept is dead as a doornail." It's just a vivid, absolute rejection. The Indian National Congress had zero interest in stepping backward to negotiate dominion status when they had already demanded complete, outright independence. So what was the fallout? Total political polarization. The British offer entirely failed to secure cooperation or unite the factions. Congress rejected it completely, with Mahatma Gandhi even stating that this declaration had actually widened the gulf between the nationalists and the British rulers. On the flip side, the Muslim League actually welcomed the offer, specifically because of that veto assurance given to minorities, and used the moment to reiterate partition as their only acceptable solution. The offer, which was supposed to bring the parties together, ironically just reinforced their entirely divergent paths. Okay, part four, the Individual Satyagraha. With the British offer dead in the water, Gandhi pivoted to a new strategic response, a meticulously controlled individual satyagraha, instead of launching a massive, potentially uncontrollable uprising. His logic here was incredibly precise. First, he wanted to prove that nationalist patience wasn't a sign of weakness. Second, he aimed to express total public disinterest in the war, powerfully equating the evils of Nazism with the double autocracy that currently ruled India.
And third, he wanted to give the government one more peaceful window to accept their demands. So carefully chosen individuals, like Vinoba Bhave and Nehru, would court arrest by publicly demanding freedom of speech against the war, marching toward Delhi in what became known as the Delhi Chalo movement.
And when you look at the numbers for this, it's actually staggering. Even though it was literally called an Individual Satyagraha, by May of 1941, 25,000 people had been convicted for civil disobedience. Think about that scale. It evolved into a massive, undeniable demonstration of nonviolent non-cooperation. The momentum is really building fast now. Just look at this timeline. From the ministries resigning in late 39 to those absolute demands and the failed August offer in 1940. But as we accelerate toward March 1942, the game completely changes. Japanese aggression in Southeast Asia was bringing the realities of the war directly to India's borders. The dynamic shifts entirely from tense political negotiation to absolute, scrambling desperation.
Let's dive right into the climax of this chess match with Part 5, the Cripps mission.
To really get why Staffer Cripps was sent over in March 1942, you have to understand the immense global pressure facing Britain at this exact moment. Britain was suffering massive reverses in Southeast Asia. The threat of a Japanese invasion of India was terrifyingly real. Plus, Britain's allies, we're talking the USA, the USSR, and China, were applying incredible pressure on them to secure Indian cooperation. Add to that, Indian nationalists had made a conditional offer. They would support the Allied cause, but only if a substantial transfer of power happened immediately, with full independence promised after the war. Desperation literally forced Britain's hand to send a mission with real concessions. Because of that sheer desperation, the proposals Cripps brought were unprecedented departures from past policies. This wasn't vague talk anymore. Constitution making would now be solely, not just mainly, in Indian hands. And a concrete blueprint for the Constituent Assembly was finally provided. A free India could even choose to withdraw from the Commonwealth entirely. But the real bombshell? The most controversial shift was a clause stating that any province not willing to join the new union could opt out and form a separate union. They effectively put a structural blueprint for partition right there on the table.
And that leads us to the final stalemate, Part 6, the deal collapses.
You'd think these massive, unprecedented concessions would be a game changer, right? Well, no. Both major Indian parties fundamentally rejected the plan. Let's look at why. Congress objected because the deal still only offered dominion status, lacked an immediate transfer of defense powers, and they vehemently opposed the right of provinces to secede. They saw that as a direct, fatal blow to national unity. The Muslim League, however, rejected it for pretty much the exact opposite reasons. They criticized the whole idea of a single Indian union, rejected the machinery of the Constituent Assembly, and felt the proposals denied the absolute, guaranteed creation of Pakistan. It was an impossible deadlock. Congress saw the mission as way too divisive, while the League saw it as not divisive enough.
The sheer frustration over the lack of immediate, real power, especially regarding India's defense during a world war, is perfectly captured in this biting criticism from Jawaharlal Nehru, who was an official negotiator for the Congress. He pointed out that under the Cripps plan, the existing structure and autocratic powers would remain, and a few of us will become the viceroy's liveried camp followers and look after canteens and the like. It brilliantly highlights the stark difference between holding a fancy title and wielding actual sovereign authority when a crisis hits.
And then, of course, you have Mahatma Gandhi's legendary, brutally dismissive summary of the entire Cripps mission. He simply called it a post-dated check. It's just a brilliant distillation of the total collapse of trust between the two sides. The British were offering vast, sweeping powers for after the war was won, but the nationalists wanted sovereignty now. They had absolutely zero faith in a check that could only be cashed in some uncertain post-war future. Which leaves us with a really provocative thought to end on today. We've mapped out this timeline of absolute constitutional deadlock. The lines were drawn so deeply that neither a global world war, nor the desperate pressure of Allied powers, nor the imminent threat of a Japanese invasion could force a compromise. Looking at the total collapse of the Cripps mission, you have to ask, if these extreme external pressures couldn't unite the factions or forge a workable deal, was the violent partition of the subcontinent already inevitable by 1942? It's a heavy question for sure, but one that really forces us to re-examine the sheer gravity of this historical chess match. Thank you so much for exploring this complex explainer with me today.